We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Heyam and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 45b. And the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa which said that if you have dam that becomes tamei, vizarko, and it was sprinkled, it was thrown. So if that was done b'shogeg, if that was done by mistake, hortza, then the carbon is accepted. B'mezid, but if the blood was applied on purpose, so then lo hortza, then the carbon is not accepted. And Rashi explains b'mezid lo hortza, again, if it's done on purpose, it's not accepted. Kenasa de Rabbanan, this is a fine imposed by the Rabbanan. V'lo sheyav yacher, it does not mean that you should bring another carbon. And Rashi continues and explains the imkain, because if so, if the Rabbanan were able to say to bring another carbon, nimsu bezdin masnin lak or davarman Torah, ulahavi chulin lazar, would come out that Bezdin is uprooting something from the Torah and saying that you should bring chulin, a non-carbon, to the azar, which cannot be. Ella rather lo hortza lahater basar ba'achila. What it means lo hortza, that the carbon is not accepted, it means it's not accepted to permit the meat to be eaten. Aval bailim nischapru, but the owners are going to get a kapara, they are going to get an atonement. V'hachi amar la Shmuel b'Meseches Yevamas, and this is what Shmuel says in Meseches Yevamas. And the brisa continues, B'med devarim amurim, when is this true? B'yachid, that's by a carbon yachid, a carbon of an individual. Avol b'tzibur, but if it's a communal carbon, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, whether it was by mistake, whether it was on purpose, hortza, the carbon will be accepted. Uv'ovdei kochavim, and when it comes to idolaters, when it comes to non-Jews, bein b'shogeg, uvein b'mezid, whether it was done by mistake or on purpose, again, where you had the zrikas hadam and the dam was tamei, lo hortza, it will not be accepted. And the Gemara continues, Amru Rabbanan Kame de Rapapa. The Rabbanan said this over in front of Rapapa, and they said, Kaman, who does this follow? Delok Rabbi Yossi. It seems to not follow Rabbi Yossi. Rashi explains, Kaman, who does this follow? Hadakatani de Ovde Kochavim lo hortza. When it says in the Brisa that if it's a carbon of Ovde Kochavim, it's not accepted. Delok Rabbi Yossi. It seems not like Rabbi Yossi. Di'i Rabbi Yossi, because if it were Rabbi Yossi, Ha'amar, didn't Rabbi Yossi say on the previous Amud, B'chulan ani roa lahachmir, in all of these situations, one should be strict when it comes to the karbanos of Ovdei Kochavim. And the point over here is that according to Rabbi Yossi, we treat the karbanos of Ovdei Kochavim the same as the karbanos of Jews, and so therefore you wouldn't make a distinction. Whatever the halacha is by a carbon from a Jew, the same halacha is going to be by a carbon from a non-Jew. That's why it seems like this brisa is not like Rabbi Yossi. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lahu Rapapa, Rapapa said to the Rabban, and he said to them, Afilu Tamer Rabbi Yossi. You can even say that this brisa follows Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi would agree that over here we do make a distinction if the carbon is coming from Ovdei Kochavim, because Shani Hasam, it's different over there, Diyamar Kra, because the Pasuk says, Lahem to them, Veloli Ovdei Kochavim, and not to Ovdei Kochavim. And we will take a look at the full pasuk being referred to over here. The pasuk is talking about the tzitz, which causes karbanos to be accepted even betuma, which is the case that the Bryce is discussing. The pasuk says, "V'hayal meitzach Aaron v'nasa Aaron es avon hakodoshim asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael." That refers to the fact again that this carries the burden of the sin. This is what causes the carbon to be accepted. L'chol matanos kodshehem v'hayal mitzchot tamid l'rotzon lohem lifnei Hashem. Again, it says lohem, and we understand lohem v'lo leovdei kochavim. But the Gemara continues and asks, Amar le Rav Huna bereider Rav Nasan le Rav Papa. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Nasan, said to Rav Papa, Elameat, according to that, if you darshan the word lahem in that fashion, so what about Asher Heim Makdishim? What about the pasuk of Asher Heim Makdishim? That's talking also about a carbon that's brought betuma. We'll see the full pasuk. Daber al Aaron ve'al Bana v'inozru mikodshe v'nei Yisrael v'lo yechalu es shem kodshi Asher Heim Makdishim li ani Hashem. So Asher Heim, we should say the same basic idea. Asher Heim Makdishim hachinami. We should say over here also, Heim v'lo Ovdei Kochavim, that by them and not by Ovdei Kochavim. Rashi explains, Zelameata asher heim makdishim li d'chsiv gabe v'yinozru. This is written by v'yinozru, again, to separate, talking about a situation of Tumah. Hachinami heim v'lo Ovdei Kochavim. V'teiman, we should say, if we make that drasha of heim v'lo Ovdei Kochavim, we should say, the kodshe Ovdei Kochavim ein chayovin aleihem mishum Tumah, that by kodshe Ovdei Kochavim, one is not liable mishum Tumah, one is not liable in a situation of Tumah l'Rabbi Yossi, according to Rabbi Yossi. But v'haka amar, but Rabbi Yossi himself said, b'kulan ani roa lahachmir, that I think one should be strict, and he said specifically that there is a liability in terms of consuming a carbon bituma. So therefore, again, it seems that Rabbi Yossi is not making this drasha. And so the Gemara continues and answers instead, El Amar Rav Ashi, rather Rav Ashi says, Amar Krutz, because the Pasuk says, and this is the same Pasuk that was quoted earlier, again, this is the Pasuk of Ahayal Meitzach Aron talking about the tzitz. It says in that Pasuk, L'rotzon Lahem, it says again, it's going to be accepted for them. The Ovdei Kochavim Lav B'nei Hartzah Ninu, Ovdei Kochavim are not considered to be B'nei Hartzah. And Rashi explains, L'rotzon Lahem, Gabe Tzitz Ksiv, again, this is written by the tzitz, and Lav B'nei Hartzah, again, Ovdei Kochavim, they're not B'nei Hartzah, they're not in the category of acceptance, meaning B'nei Hartzah LaHaKadosh Baruch Hu Hem She'eno Misratza Lahem. Again, it means to say acceptance to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They are not in that category of acceptance, and so therefore the Braisa distinguishes between the Karbanos of Jews and the Karbanos of Ovdei Kochavim. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Devarim she'ein chayavim aleim misham pigol, items which there's no liability in terms of pigol, but still chayavin aleihen misham nosar, there's still liability in terms of nosar, umisham tameh, and there's also liability in terms of tumah, chutz min hadam, with the exception of blood. Rashi explains, Devarim she'ein chayavin aleim misham pigol kagon, for example, hakometz, v'haketoras, v'chol hashnuyim b'mishnah seinu, all of those items listed in the Mishnah earlier, the kometz, the ketoras, etc., there's no liability for eating them in terms of pigol, but chayavin aleim misham tumah, there's a liability of tumah, meaning kares, a person's going to get kares, ha'ochlan, b'tumas haguf, if he eats those items, b'tumas haguf, v'yal shegagasim, if he does it by mistake, chatos, there'll be a carbon chatos, kediyolef b'gemara, as will be learned in the Gemara. And then the Mishnah said, chutz min hadam, with the exception of blood, di'imit behedya, that's excluded explicitly, keda'amar v'gemara, as the Gemara will say. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon mechayiv b'davar shedarkon lechol. Rabbi Shimon says chayiv, buy something with which it's normal to eat it. It's the way to eat it. Aval ha'etzim, but by wood, v'halavona, frankincense, v'akatoras, and the incense. Ein chayavin aleihen misham tumah. There's no chayiv because of tumah. And Rashi explains, Hachi Garsinon, this is the proper text, Numi Rabbi Shimon b'davar shedarko lechol chayiv. Rashi says, "V'kach shamati mi beis midrasho shel Rabbeinu Yaakov." This is what I heard from the beis medrash of Rabbeinu Yaakov. V'li nemar shekach pirush Rabbeinu Meshulam bar Klunim is Gaon. Rabbeinu Meshulam bar Klunim is Gaon explained it as follows: that b'shas misaso numi Rabbi Shimon, at the time of his death, Rabbi Shimon said, "Kimo Amar Rabbi Shimon." That would be like Amar Rabbi Shimon. Numi Rabbi Shimon is the same as Amar Rabbi Shimon. Uvesvarim hayakasav, in the Svarim it was written Hadam, and the Girsa in the Shinei Nuschos says Hadam v'numi. Again, that's the girsa. In any case, Rabbi Shimon says that bedavar shedarko lechol, by something that its way is to be eaten, shederech b'nei adam lechol, meaning it's something that people generally eat. V'yafal pi shezeh min haniktarim, even though it's something which is burned, kagon kometz, for example, a kometz is normally eaten. Minchas kohanim is totally burned, but it could be eaten. It's a kind of food that would normally be eaten. V'domin and things similar to that. So then we say chayiv in that situation by davar shedarko lechol. Aval levona ve'etzim uktoras ein chayav. But by the frankincense, by wood, by incense, those are not things that are normally eaten. So there's no liability due to tumah. V'rabbanan pligi Allah. Now the Rabbanan argue on this. K'demarbinan luhu mikol habasar yisera l'rabos eitzim u'levona. They have a riboy, they have an inclusion that says that we include the eitzim and the levona in this liability. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught, Yochol lo yehu chayavin misham tumah ela al davar sheyesh lo matirin bein la'adam bein lamizbeach. One might think that when it comes to liability for tumah, one might think it should be the same as pigul. As we said earlier, when it comes to pigul, it has to be something in the carbon where there's a matter, there is a permitter, whether we're talking about a matter that now people can eat from the carbon, or whether we're talking about a matter that now that part of the carbon, the sacrificial portion, can be burned on the mizbeach, but it has to be davar sheyesh lo matirin. So one might think when it comes to tumah as well, that's true. And again, the Mishnah said, of course, that is not the case. When it comes to pigul, it has to be a davar sheyesh lo matir, and otherwise there's no liability. But our Mishnah is specifically saying that even things which there's no liability for pigul, there is liability for tumah. So the Braisa here is saying one might think that tumah should be the same as pigul. Vidinu, and it would be logical as follows. We can make a kal v'chomer. Uma pigul shu b'kviyah. When it comes to eating pigul b'shogeg, so you bring a chatos kavua, you bring a regular chatos. It's not a variable chatos. It's the same carbon that is brought, whether the person is poor or rich. He always brings a sheep or a goat, a female sheep or a female goat. Uvi yediyah achas, also it's a situation of yediyah achas. Rashi says, Uvi yediyah achas, she'eno tzarech yediyah b'tchila, she'achal b'shogeg v'yada she'achal. You don't need to have that original yediyah, a yediyah in the beginning and a yediyah in the end. It's just a simple situation where he eats b'shogeg, and then he finds out, then he becomes aware that he does the aveira. That's what the case is by pigul b'shogeg. yediyah achas, a regular case of awareness after committing the Avera b'shogeg. And furthermore, v'lo hutter mechlalo, also when it comes to pigul, it's never permitted, like we find by Tumah, it's permitted b'tzibur, it's permitted when it's the public, but we don't find that when it comes to pigul. So if pigul has all of these qualities, and ein chayav and all of ela al davar sheyesh lo matir and bein lo adam bein lo mizbeach, but yet we say that pigul, there's only liability on the parts of the carbon that have a matir, whether a matir for a person or a matir for the mizbeach. So therefore, tumah, when it comes to tumah, shehi ba'ola v'yored, where the carbon that's brought is a variable carbon, uv'shtei yedios, and then there's two awarenesses, v'hutra michlal, and it is something that's mutter, again in situations of the tzibur. So eino din, so isn't it logical to say, she'eino chayev ela al davar sheyesh lo matirin, bein lo adam bein lo mizbeach? It should be exactly like pigul. There should only be liability if it's something that has a matir, whether we're talking about a matir to a person or a matir to the mizbeach. And Rashi explains, shehi ba'ola v'yored, again, it's a variable carbon chatos when it comes to tumah. Lo asher behema, if the person's wealthy, he brings an animal, let's say committed this avera. Uvidalus shtei torim, uvidali dalus asir sa'efa. If the person is poor, he brings bird karbonos. If the person is very poor, he brings an asir sa'efa, like a carbon mincha. Gabe shmias kol v'vayikra, that's what we find in Parshas Vayikra. Uvishtei yedios, and also by tumah we find that there's two awarenesses, meaning nitma v'yoda shenitma. It has to be that he's tamei, he knows that he was tamei. V'nelma mimenu tumah, then he has a lapse of awareness about the tumah. V'yachal es hakodesh, then he eats kodesh. V'lo yad, he doesn't know. Umisha'achal, and then from after that yada, then he has an awareness. Avol sheyesh ba yediyah b'sof, ve'in ba yediyah b'tchila. But let's say there was awareness at the end, but not in the beginning. Before he ate, he didn't know about the tumah. So Pater, he's actually exempt in that case. And v'hutra mechlala, it's also mutter, tumas haguf hutra eitzel tzibur. But Pesach, by the community, when you have tumah, when the community is tameh, it's actually mutter by the carbon Pesach, tetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, ha-Pesach sheba b'tumah, nechol b'tumah. If the carbon Pesach is brought b'tumah, then it's eaten b'tumah. And so therefore one would have thought that we should treat the tumas haguf the same way that we treat pigul. It should be again, eino chayev ela davar sheyesh lo matir bein lo adam bein lo mizbeach. And so the Brisa continues and says that we don't say that. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says asher heim makdishim li. The pasuk says asher heim makdishim li, and Rashi explains Talmud Lomer asher heim makdishim riba kol hamukdashim. We include everything that is sanctified. V'gabe v'yinazru ksiv. This is written by v'yinazru, which is talking about tumah, and so therefore it's not only going to be davar sheyesh lo matir, but even all of those parts of the carbon and all of those items that we listed in the earlier Mishnah that there's no liability to pigul. There is a liability if the person is tamei, is tumas haguf, and he eats those parts of the carbon, those parts of the kodesh. And the Brisa continues, Yachol miyad. Now one might think that this should be true immediately. Rashi explains, Yachol miyad mishahuktashu, meaning from when they are consecrated, mischayev olav miyad emachlu b'tumah. Immediately there's going to be liability if they are eaten b'tumah once they are consecrated. But so the Brisa says, Talmud Lomar yikrav. The pasuk says yikrav. And Rashi explains, Tamalomar Asher Yikrav Mikol Zarachem. It says Asher Yikrav Mikol Zarachem. Rebbe Lozer Mefarish Lavi Azal. And as we're going to go on, Rebbe Lozer is going to explain as the Brisa now continues. Amar Rebbe Lozer says, V'chayesh no geyashu chayev. Are we talking about a person touching that he's liable? Elamat Talmud Lomar Yikrav. So what does it mean Yikrav if you're not liable for touching? What it actually means is Behuchshar Basar Li Karev Hakasam Medaber. We're talking about when the meat was rendered fit to be offered. That's when there is that liability. Haketzad, how so? Yeshlo matirin. If there is a matir, mishayikruv matirin, then it's when the matir is offered. And ein lo matirin, if there is no permitter, so then mishayikdash bekli. So then it's going to be from the moment it's sanctified in the vessel. And Rashi explains, v'chayesh nogei achayev, is a person liable for touching. V'aloeno chayev elim kein achal. It's only if the person is tamei and he eats. He eats the kodesh. K'dechsiv ish ishmi zer aron, like it's written in the pasuk. B'huch shali karev. So what the pasuk actually means is that it's rendered fit to be offered. Meaning v'akadshim kai. We're going on kadshim. V'hachi kamer, it means as follows. Asher yakrev kadshim v'yachar kach yochlem v'tuma olav. Again, he's going to offer the kadshim and he eats them and he's tamei. K'dem efaresh achila b'krad basrei, as it says achila in the pasuk following, and it means to say yesh lo matir, and let's say it's a part of the carbon that has a matir, could go murim, like the sacrificial portions. You sprinkle the blood, you apply the blood, and then you could bring the portions on the mizbeach. Uvasur, or the meat, which is eaten, let's say, by people after you bring the matir. Shahadam matir, and the blood is the matir for the emurim and the basar, as we've said earlier. Ushiari menachos shahakometz matir, and the remainder of the carbon mincha is matir, is permitted by the kometz. Mishayikruvu matir. So then we go know by when the matter was offered. And it's at that point in time that there's a liability. V'she'ein lo matir, and let's say something that has no matir. Could go in minchas kohanim, for example. Minchas kohanim is totally burned. V'kohen Mashiach, the mincha of the kohen gadol, and Nesachim, and the libations. Mishayikdashu bekli. So then, there still is a liability, even though there's no matir. That's what we've been saying. But nevertheless, it's only going to be a liability from the moment it's sanctified in the vessel. Shu machshiran la'achila ha'amura behen, because that's what prepares them to be eaten, again, for the achila, which is stated by them. And the Gemara continues and says, Eshkechon Tumah, so now we have found the source by Tumah that there's a liability. Noser Manolan, where do we find this halacha by Noser? Meaning again that the Noser applies even in areas, even by parts of the carbon that Pigul might not apply to. So Asi Chilul Chilul Mi Tumah. So the Gemara says we have a Gzer Shava, Chilul Chilul from Tumah. We learn from Tumah to Noser. The Gemara says, V'leilif Avon Mi Pigul, but why not learn a different Gzer Shava? We can have a Gzer Shava of Avon from Pigul and then say that Noser is exactly like Pigul, not like Tumah. And the Gemara says, Mistabra mi Tumah havalei lamelef, it makes more sense to learn from Tumah, Shekain Gezel Siman, because Gezel is a mnemonic for the things that Noser and Tumah have in common, so therefore it makes more sense to learn Noser from Tumah than to learn from Pigul. But the Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, mi Pigul havalei lamelef, it's better, it makes more sense to learn from Pigul, learn Noser from Pigul, because Shekain Noser tzitz tar bizman karev, you have all of those things in common, we'll see Rashi in a moment, but Vahani Nefishon, that's even more things that are in common. There's more things that are in common between Pigul and Noser than between Noser and Tumah. And so the Gemara instead says, Ela rather mi Tani Levi. It's from what Levi taught. Tani Levi, because Levi taught, Minayin sha'af bepsul zman hakosim medaber. From where do we know that even by a time disqualification like Noser, that the pasuk is talking about that? Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, V'lo yechalalu es. And Rashi explains, Noser menolan dechayev olav afal davar shein lo matir. And how do we know that by Noser there's a liability even on the parts of the carbon that do not have a matir? Kiriktani masnisin devarim shein chayavin alein mishum pigul, chayavin alein mishum Noser. As we learned in our Mishnah, that the items which you're not chayev due to pigul, but you are chayev when it comes to Noser. And the Gemara then said, Shekain gezel simin, that gezel is a mnemonic, means to say as follows, Noser v'tumah psul haguf. When it comes to Noser and Tumah, they have in common the fact that they are both psul haguf, meaning to say, when you're talking about Tumah, you're talking about the person being Tameh. When you're talking about Noser, you're talking about the item being left over too long. Upigul psul machshava. When it comes to Pigul, that's an intention type of psul. Noser v'tumah, and furthermore, so that's the gimel, that's haguf. Noser v'tumah ein zrikas hadam meviyasan lidei psul. And when it comes to Noser and Tumah, it's not the throwing of the blood, the application of the blood, that causes the disqualification. The Zayin stands for zrikas hadam. Upigul, but when it comes to Pigul, zrikas hadam kovasa b'psul. As we said earlier, it's the zrikas hadam which establishes that it is now disqualified, that it's now Pigul. And Noser v'tameh, when it comes to Noser and Tameh, nemar b'hen chilul, it says the word chilul, that's the lamed and gezel. So those are what Noser and Tumah have in common. But then the Gemara said, well, still Noser and Pigul have more things in common. Shekain hutar tzitz tar bizman karev v'hani nefishon. You have all those things in common, and there are more of them. Rashi explains, Noser u Pigul lo hutru michlalan ketuma. First of all, Noser and Pigul, they don't become permitted, meaning, let's say, permitted by the tzibur like Tumah does. So that's hutter. Ve'ein had sitz meratza alayu. Also by Tumah, that sitz allows Tumah to be accepted. You don't have that by Noser and Pigul. Ketuma, like Tumah, again, that sitz is meratza by Tumah. V'afagav de v'tumas haguf ko'amina she'ein had sitz meratza ala. Now, even though we're talking about Tumas haguf, where we don't say that sitz is meratza, but she'ein Tumah mihas nirtzis b'tzitz. But in general, Tumah in general is something that the tzitz allows acceptance for. And what does it mean, tar? Tar means shnehem tahorin. It means that when you're talking about Noser and Pigul, they're both pure, but obviously Tumah is not pure. Ushneim nifsalin bizman, also, they both have to do with zman, with time. Zeh b'noser chutz lizman, v'zeh b'machshavas zman. But when we're talking about Noser, we're talking about that the time actually ran out, it's actually remained past the time. And by Pigul, it's an intention to be outside of the proper time. Ushneim psulin b'karev. And then the last one was, they're both disqualifications by the karev, by what is being offered, meaning to say it's a psul not in the person, but it's a psul in the carbon. The Noser was left too long, the Pigul, the carbon itself becomes Pigul. Le'afuke tumas haguf, that's different than tumas haguf. Shepsulan b'makrav, there it's the person offering, it's the person who is the one that's tameh. And then the Gemara said, Minayin shaf bipsul zman hakos medaber. The Gemara brought a new source. How do we know that we're talking about a disqualification of time? Meaning, Hai krod v'yinozru, this pasuk of v'yinozru, which is really talking about tumah. How do I know it also applies to psul zman, meaning to nosar? V'lo yechalalu d'chsiv gabe tumah. V'lo yechalu again is written by tumah. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph.